Yeah. Okay. Okay. Live. Great. Well, welcome today, Fiona, Becky. Great to you can be joining. We're going to have a conversation about a very specific topic, specific angle. Um, I've been here at COP for quite a few days, hearing lots and lots of things, and probably like most people I speak to, kind of feeling like, well, what is it we can do? What is it we can contribute? What is our agency and our role? And one of the things which, and I'll just do a little intro of the topic before we get into a discussion. One of the things which I've been interested in for some time is the role of money. Particular angle um, that we highlighted in a report last year was the carbon bankroll, and that is looking at how can companies influence climate action through their finances, their financial supply chains. It's not something which is that obvious, perhaps. Um, just quick grounding. In terms of the money, we've heard lots of things on day one of COP, for example, 450 million. Well, it sounds like millions, so that's like a big number. But actually, compared to the 1.5 trillion in philanthropic foundations, the 1.5 trillion in just the top 100 universities, mostly in the US, and the 1 trillion of liquidity in companies, just the top 13 companies in the world, that number there is 9,000 times bigger than that um, loss and damage fund that was announced on day one of COP. So there's huge amounts of money in the system, and it's not necessarily managed consciously in terms of what it's doing, because from the point of view of a company, it looks like that's just the cash we need to have on hold. But it's not on hold, it's not in a vault, it's in the financial system. It's either being lent out through the banking system, it's in capital markets. We did a report called the Carbon Bankroll, looking at where that money was. So we took all of the NK reports from large companies, we tracked that through to the different corporate deposits or the bond portfolios. And made an estimation, and it is only an estimation based on sort of averages of banks' um, carbon emissions, which you can do from the PCAF data for, well, what would that money that they've got mean in carbon terms? And what we found was that for some of these large companies, a lot of these are big um, tech companies like Apple and others who've got billions in liquidity, um, that it was maybe one of the largest sources of carbon emissions that they have. Um, in the case of Apple, pretty much equates to all of the kind of products which they make, sell, distribute every year. We were looking at it and going, that can't be right. It's just like that just doesn't track. But when you think about all of the supply chain sustainability that companies like Apple do, and then you consider that at the time they had almost $200 billion of cash on the balance sheet, you start to see how it does add up. We put out the report. It went out in Wall Street Journal. Bill McKibben covered it in New Yorker. Paul Polman said here, one of the biggest levers companies can have to accelerate shift is the cash balances they are holding. But this is an entirely new behavior. This is not something which they will have been familiar with doing, or even aware of being able to have an impact. Since the publication of the report, Topo Finance and others working this with Exponential Roadmap Initiative put out the Greening Cash Action Guide. So, well, what is it you can do? First, you need to understand what you've got. So, gathering some of the data, and then having an engagement with your bank. And there are many companies, Patagonia, other large companies who we've been talking to, starting to really have dialogue and scrutinizing, well, what is it you're doing, and bringing up what they want in terms of climate positive investment, and then potentially looking at how money can shift. If you are a global multinational, you can't just necessarily shift all your banking overnight. However, there are many things which you might be able to do through product selection, through looking at what might be available, through engaging also with financial providers to be able to make real changes. This is a representation of how things work. It's basically sort of saying that that all money in financial institutions doesn't stay there. It goes into the real economy. If you track it all the way down the chain, no matter how many subsidiaries or layers are there, you will find real activities with real emissions. And there is a chain of influence and agency. Banks and others are now mandated to look at this, to understand this. So how can companies take this insight to be able to mobilize uh, the change that they want to see? That is the grounding. That's kind of enough from me. It's a real pleasure to have both Fiona and Becky here, two complementary insights. So Fiona from WBCSD, but also somebody who understands treasury, and from the banks, from the bank side. So you've been able to now talking to companies, but also understanding how things work in a financial institution. This is not something which is familiar. In fact, it probably would have people sort of saying, what on earth is this you're talking about?" Um, how would you imagine opening up a conversation with some of the people in companies or in back in your banking days about this topic?
Thanks, James, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. Congratulations on Carbon Bankroll report. It is a really helpful spotlight on a hidden issue, as you say. So, um, yeah, as you alluded to, bit of a treasury background. I was a treasury lawyer for RBS NatWest for 10 years and worked on the climate strategy. So, coming from that world into doing a stint in the private sector and now working at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where we work in an area called Redefining Value. And we, among other forums, have a CFO network and work with the finance teams on all the emerging areas, but look at their strategies. So familiar with how the corporate finance teams are working and the real challenges they're under, particularly as the reporting regimes start to bite and they're mobilizing around what is a really historic challenge. So in the context of finance teams already being under quite a lot of pressure and scrutiny on this space, I think that adds to the limited amount of bandwidth that they have to really factor this in. And there are a number of factors that are behind that. There's the focus on reporting and the integration of that, but I think also the way that the Scope 3 system is working at the moment, it's not immediately obvious, and they don't think about it. And to be honest, I think we do that on an individual level as well. And so as we think about our own bank balances and who we're banking with and where our pensions are, corporates need to start doing the same thing, but in a similar way to how our own banking is not considered in our own footprint often. It's the same with corporates. So it's an area of potential influence in the same way that any supply chain now has influence. So this is a B2B relationship on a very, very large scale. So the big corporates that are in your reports have very, very significant banking relationships with large institutional banks, and particularly US companies will have a focus on US bank. And that B2B dynamic I don't see as a customer to banking isn't one that we hear much about, right? We hear a lot about how banks are under prudential pressure to focus on their downstream financed emissions. I don't see a lot of recognition and dialogue about the power that corporates have as customers to push it back up. And I think, in full admiration of all the engaged sustainability and finance teams across the corporate world right now. So expecting them to do an additional activity is always going to be challenging. But I think it's one where they could quite easily have a lot of influence, and you see that now with Patagonia. And so I think when you think as a corporate, where can I have influence in the system? It is a really helpful area to focus on because corporate treasury is very, very complicated. And you look at, I mean, you cite Amazon in your report. That 81 billion or so will be put to use in a myriad of different ways. So I think it's important to understand that that is not $80 billion that they have to sort of uniquely go and put to work and focus on. A lot of it is will need to be kept as cash just for ongoing operations. A lot of it will be cash that they don't necessarily have a lot of control over where it goes. So it's clear, I think it's not, this is not an equity example. And where it is an equity example, it will get caught in scope 1 and 2. So when it's free float cash that you're putting on deposit with large banks, there is a lack of control. And that's why it becomes an institutional relationship. So I think being very conscious at corporates, being very conscious about who you're banking with and what those banks own strategies is very important. And I think in that context, it's a shame in Europe we've been working on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I think it is a real shame that we're seeing the likelihood that the finance sector will be kept outside of that, because that will have the impact. Whereas the rest of the world, the rest of the supply chain value chain will be put under enormous pressure to actively due diligence their supply chain and their customers, to actively look for credible transition plans in their B2B arrangements, actively look for their approach to climate science. Financial institutions are potentially, depending on the final text, going to be exempt from that. So I think that's something to be mindful of too, because it will perpetuate this sort of shadow approach to the exposure.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and feels ironic in the nature of that. I was on the transition plan task force, and a big theory of change is that financial institutions will be scrutinizing transition plans. That's what they're for. I mean, it's that part of their implied role. But I mean, but financial institutions say, at least banks always say, well, we're here to do what, things for our customers, but it tends to not necessarily transfer to some of these meta requests. It's just sort of customer demands, but that feels like maybe the new angle to push.
I think that's right. And I think it's going to be important for banks to be listening to their customers, because that has been a downward flow. So banks are very busy looking at their corporate customers' transition plans because they need to have a credible transition plan. But be mindful that that scrutiny will come back to you. And you need to be ready. You need to be educating your frontline client staff so that they're ready for that conversation. And you need to be, I think, listening carefully to your customers. So making sure, and this applies to corporates too, making sure that you are hearing, collating, aggregating, communicating that to leadership. Because the B2B voice, in my experience in the private sector, has been the most powerful influence for driving change. The regulatory agenda, fine. But when you say our customers care, our customers are making decisions about who they do business with because they are looking for this, that is very powerful. And so being able to aggregate that voice and communicate it up can be a real agent for change.
That's great. I mean, that's the powerful insight here and the opportunity. Becky, maybe to use your perspective, you're very much kind of into the how to do this, and being able to kind of get some of these perspectives, making sense of the numbers. What's your perspective on this and the potential?
Um, Kira, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And again, congratulations on your work. Um, yeah, so I work with Generate Zero in New Zealand, and in New Zealand we now have in law the requirement to report to disclose your financial implications, climate related disclosure in line with the TCFD framework, and that is now in force for all listed entities. So it's about 200 entities within the New Zealand economy, the largest players in the New Zealand economy. Um, what I would say is at the moment the narrative is very much around, I guess, the inverse of what you and Fiona have been talking about. So it's the what are the financed emissions? That's where they're starting. So what are the financial institutions' financed emissions? So what we do at Generate Zero is we've developed a platform that enables all sorts of entities to measure their emissions and has a module for financed emissions for category 15. And so we've been working with the main banks in the New Zealand economy to help them to measure their emissions. Now, I should say that several of them have been doing this on a voluntary basis for some time. Far and away, the biggest challenge is data, availability of good information. So the asset classes that we've started with are residential lending, mortgage portfolios. And for a couple of years, the banks have been worrying about how they are going to find that data to estimate and then measure their financed emissions in line with the PCAF methodologies that you were talking about. So there's reasonably good sort of DQ3 level information about residential mortgage books. They're building up their data sets on business lending, insurance portfolios, particularly household insurance. So we're sort of working through those asset classes. In the New Zealand context, agriculture is a big one. So agricultural lending is going to be financing some significant emissions. So I would say the stage of maturity that we're at now is the first tranche of mandatory disclosures are now being published. So for reporting years from January 2023. So the next big question or point of interest will be what do we see in those first tranche of disclosures? what I suspect we're going to see in the first tranche is very, very mixed quality and probably quite limited insight in the first instance. So it is going to be a journey of multiple years to iterate that. But I think the mandatory regime has really forced a lot of attention onto this area. We're certainly not at the point yet where we're seeing the reverse of customers, borrowers starting to think about where they are placing their financial services. But I think you're absolutely right. That B2B conversation is when it's really going to drive a shift in behavior.
So thank you, and we'll bring in Simon in a moment. Welcome. I just want to follow though, Becky, in terms of the data. So there's now a net zero data public utility. There's data sources. There's more coverage in some of these PCAF reports. But if you're a business, it's not probably the first place you'll go to kind of dig into annual reports and then find the PCAF data and have a look at the coverage. How how can we get this data in a meaningful enough form when you see, so Christian Aid, for example, a UK-based charity, just switched 100 million of their reserves from Barclays to Lloyds on the basis of their fossil fuel investment policy. That was something which was more, it was a policy insight. The general estimation was, well, there's just going to be more fossil fuels over here than over there. We know that the downstream is going to be that. It's roughly right. We can make a decision. How do we get data useful decisions packaged up in the best way to take action now, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question because the data really does vary. It needs to be very specific and granular to be meaningful. So you need really high quality information about each specific market and each specific asset class that you're operating within. So I think what would be really helpful would be global data standards and some form of sort of open source data sharing agreements that so countries can learn from one another and we can start to build a global sort of portfolio. And certainly some of the private data companies are doing that. One thing we find being a relatively small country, relatively far away, is that there's very limited data available in those global data sets. So what we have to do is supplement those quite a lot. Otherwise, it's very generic and very averaged. And as you suggest, you can't make good quality decisions from generic, averaged information.
Yeah. Maybe turning to Simon, welcome. Um,
I'm mortified. I'm really sorry. For some reason, I thought we were starting at 10:30, so I
oh, no, it's
really
it's okay.
just no. I definitely take the heat on this. I take the
It's
heat.
okay.
I
Yeah.
shouldn't really say that at COP28, right? Okay. So I'm really sorry. I apologize, particularly.
That's okay. It's wonderful that you're here. I mean, Simon, Nature Finance, the original UNEP inquiry, you've seen the whole landscape of all of these developments in finance. Looking at this particular kind of segment, this particular angle, how within all the shifting landscapes of all the different initiatives and the things being announced today, how do you see this particular potential for action from corporates to the financial sector fitting into the overall landscape? What's been your reflection on the report and its potential?
God almighty. If you're old enough, you see everything, right? It's a sort of definition of God, been around for long enough, right? That just kind of caught up on all information. Look, yeah, you're probably going to have to make it more specific. You know, we're beginning to see that carbon related information channeled to the financial sector is not leading to the outcomes we want. Let's kind of call it out, right? Chevron and Exxon have just spent $113 billion together in buying major oil reserves that, if you read the speech of the Chevron CEO, when asked about climate change, his response was, let's be realistic. We're going to be using oil and gas for the foreseeable future, and that's why we're making this investment. So it's a view that he can be profitable in a 2.5-degree world. Yeah. And actually, as paradoxically, we move beyond any doubt that we're going beyond 1.5 degrees, the effect on asset pricing is that the value of fossil fuel assets goes up and the value of clean tech assets goes down. Yeah. And so actually anyone doing financial materiality based climate risk analysis and reporting, climate risk goes down as temperatures get worse, not the other way round. Yeah. Now we've got to understand that not we shouldn't have data, we need data, not that we shouldn't analyze value chains, not that we shouldn't be, all of this stuff is true, but A, it's an incremental long burn play, and B, it turns out that a materiality based climate risk lens has perverse implications where you have discontinuous change in the context that leads to significant shifts in asset pricing, which is what we're currently going through. Yeah. And so it's not about throwing this stuff under the bus, but it's about understanding that in different situations, different tools and instruments change their relative importance and have different kinds of unintended consequences. Yeah, so if I can just illustrate from a slightly different side, and then you can tell me I'm in the wrong session, right? Which is perfectly possible. Yeah, so in my world, which is not first and foremost a world of carbon, so I'm definitely in the wrong place, but is about nature. Yeah, when people ask me what are the principal instruments to ensure that the financial sector addresses nature impacts down their supply chains, or what I would call their value chains, so their investment chains. They go, "What do you think of TNFD, mate?" The Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. To which I answer, firstly, it's really important. We've invested time, money, technical input, energy, passion since it started. In fact, for a year before it started.
Yeah.
So that gives me my free pass
Yeah.
to then say, but it may turn out that although it's a brilliant catalyst for raising awareness, it turns out at the more technical level not to be a brilliant basis for shifting resources. Yeah. And they go, "What do you mean?" And I go, "Well, there may be other instruments." So, for example, the financial sector has systematically spent the last half a century trying to push all legal and regulatory liability off their balance sheet down towards their investees. Yeah. And frankly, they've been hugely successful, hugely successful. And so if BlackRock today is investing in a palm oil company that is operating on illegally deforested land in Liberia, this is a actual case. I'm at liberty to talk about it because it's extensively covered on a Bloomberg terminal. Through a financial analytics lens, Bloomberg says, BlackRock says, we don't have any credit risk because the company has a robust balance sheet. And we don't think the Liberian Ministry of Environment is ever going to take any action. Yeah, so they don't have a credit risk. They don't have a liability risk. Yeah, so the lawyers haven't got out of bed. Yeah. And yet we have complete transparency that they are benefiting. So it's not just that there is a nature crime in their value chain, but risk adjusted returns are enhanced because they're accessing profitable opportunities by effectively underpaying for ecosystem services. So it's like totally transit. So it's not a data problem. It's not a data problem. Yeah. And so we have to then, in a sense, reframe the question, which is, how does one create liability? Not just, if I can say not just, how do we ensure that the data's there?
Yes. So just picking up on that thing in terms of materiality, and without getting into all the technical stuff, we know that so much of that financial regulation sort of direction of travel has been on the single materiality. It's sort of, well, what's going to hit you financially from the stuff out there in the planet, as opposed to the what is it you're doing. And there is a regulatory agenda, and that's very much under debate. But if you are a customer of say BlackRock reading that deal, or any one of the banks that you might be going through and saying, well, this is the outward impact, this is the risk we are causing, whether or not it comes back to us financially, and you wanted to influence that, do you think that by mobilizing like the customer voice more, that the financial institutions may listen, or do you think that they will only ever listen to the regulators?
You're definitely looking for a depressing afternoon, right?
Yeah.
I can see. So I don't have to speculate. The data's quite clear. Yeah, we know a lot of, we know a lot about what types of financial institutions respond to what kinds of clients. There's no mystery here or conjecture. Yeah, unless we think the future is going to be very different from the past. So we know, first of all, that in the world of increasing uncertainty, rising inflation, food price insecurity, unemployment, problems, you know, your retail punter is less and less interested in third-party problems. Yeah, and that doesn't make them unethical. It makes them quite sensible, to be perfectly honest. And so there's a rapid increase in awareness around climate change and a rapid reduction in willingness to act in a situation of economic and other forms of insecurity. So we shouldn't over egg that story. And in the EU, for example, there are now regulations that require pension funds to explain to policyholders what they're going to use their money for, and all the data absolutely confirms that it's a complete waste of time so far. So far, yeah, everything is
Yeah.
so far. On the other hand, say work that I did in China in 2017 to 19, working with Ant Financial Services in building this Ant Forest app, to provide real-time information, gamified on carbon footprints, through the payment platform. Yeah, we have 650 million people using that app on a regular basis with an extraordinary long half-life, which we don't really understand. And so what we also know positively, is that if we treat this as a behavioral problem rather than an educational problem, so we treat it, the same way that Trump got elected effectively, that we can nudge behavior in increasingly sophisticated ways, then we can begin, if we want to. So we give up the sort of liberal dream of education and we focus on behavioral manipulation. Then there are clearly ways in which you can get retail punters to respond. We know that. So that's them. Then you've got your sort of UBSs of this world, which is basically a wealth management business. And there you've got much more latitude because no one's worried about inflation rates. So you've got a huge tsunami of high net worth money. And that is important. That is making a difference. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have said that, and today that's a much more significant play. But I would say that the reputational side rather than the transaction end. So public opinion in a world of populism counts for less and less, whereas the ability of a customer to exit or to create collective action becomes more significant.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe follow that up, and maybe Fiona, in terms of the products, because I think that we'd agree that there's not the behaviors now a lot of the time because there's not the insight. So when we were talking to companies about what is the carbon impact of your X billion dollars, it was a new question. They generally said, we've never been asked that before. We've never had that insight before. But to take things forward into actual products, and Forest was very, there's a lot of innovation in terms of how you might be able to drive behaviors. What might be the products we need? Because through a treasury, you've got to still be able to manage your own responsibility. But if you were to look at things like a green corporate deposit or a green cash management product, what are the sort of the design kind of considerations to be able to have that integrity to be able to move things forward? Because we know that some of the green products, it's not necessarily doing what people might expect from what it says on the tin.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and it hits at what I see as one of the critical tensions in the whole system right now. That we are trying to green a system on the fringes that needs to be greened from the core. And so, picking up on Simon's point, particularly with high net worth investors or large scale asset owners, most of them will say that fiduciaries and they talk to their mandate, and treasurers will say the same thing. So, or you go to corporate portfolios as I've done, and you'll say, can you consider this? They'll say it's not within my mandate. And that, I think, is the first flaw, because your mandate should be to manage for optimal returns over a period of time. And I find it hard to understand how anyone can be aware of the science, even from a fiduciary. I'm a lawyer by background, from a fiduciary background, how you can be aware of the science and not manage accordingly. And particularly if your company has set a net zero trajectory, or you're working with counterparties who have set a net zero trajectory, they should be managing for a net zero trajectory. So the challenge is right now that the system is not pricing that in, right? There's huge mispriced risk in the system. And we are using this concept of green as a way of, unfortunately, the unintended consequences that we're perpetuating that dissipation, right? Because we're looking to create new asset classes that have particular features to them, which should not be there because they should be intrinsic in everything. So I think as we hear the most compelling asset managers, and we work with quite a few asset owners, saying we don't have an ESG mandate, but we recognize the risk in the system, and that is what we are managing to. So coming back to what corporate treasurers will need, they need to maintain liquidity. That's typically what corporate treasurer will be looking for. So maintaining the cash flows to be able to keep operations going. The investment side of it will be a less core focus. So they will say, in that respect, they are managing for the business operations, not as an asset manager, which is a distinct consideration. So there it just becomes a mainstream consideration over what those products are and where they are going. It should be in line with your corporate strategy. And I do find it hard to understand how how in theory a corporate treasury could say we are not factoring in ESG at all, particularly when, as your report has pointed out, the company has adopted that particular strategy. So in terms of the products they're looking for, I think we need to be careful with the development of green. We see a real liquidity issue. There's a supply issue because there are all these issues with labeling, because there's an issue in the ability for to be able to clearly identify and price consistently the types of assets that are needed. So as a treasurer, I have some sympathy with the fact that the pressure to look for green is not going to be in line with their mandate because there are other characteristics. But coming back to my main point, it should be integral to the whole system. So forcing your banks and so as a corporate treasurer, looking to your banks to adopt a more mainstream approach to holistic risk management that factors in that net zero world and manages towards potentially a 2.8 scenario is very important.
And given that you work with sustainability people as well within the businesses in WBCSD, what advice might you give to somebody from the sustainability side who does understand the science more greater probability say than the treasurers in bringing that insight in? What would be the means of opening up that conversation, which would be unfamiliar?
So here you're trying to bridge two worlds, right? The worlds of financial management and the world of sustainability. And that is a trend across the entire corporate system. So that new ways of working, increased awareness and appreciation of each other's universes and how they now increasingly coincide is very important. So education, number one, and awareness raising. And then I have seen very constructive conversations between the sustainability teams and either the pension trustees, so manage the corporate pensions. So that was very much the case in my experience in the banking world. There were very constructive conversations with pension trustees, and they've adopted strong. So the pension area is one different from the treasury. With treasury, I think it is much harder because they are under immense pressure to keep the company moving and keep the cash flows there. And that I have seen as a slightly more challenging conversation, but it's one that just consistent inclusion, acceptance, and awareness raising of the wider situation, the wider system in which they're operating has been helpful in driving behaviors.
Yeah. And maybe Becky coming in and maybe follow on that, but also you speak to a lot of financial institutions. There is more demand. I mean, in particular in Europe, I think that there's been large property companies and others saying, well, we want green corporate deposits, we want sort of things. You're seeing some of the people moving on their financial emissions. What advice might you have to banks in terms of, well, what can they do? What can financial institutions do to make it easier for those companies who do get inspired by this insight to say, yeah, we actually have to integrate this into our strategy?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'll come back to it in a minute. I just want to build on a couple of things Fiona said. So I totally agree. The language that the sustainability professionals and what's currently the rest of the executive team or the business, uh, it can be a real struggle. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot is that upskilling challenge is really significant, and it's really difficult. You know, we've adopted Chapter Zero for governance in New Zealand, and that's starting to build capability at the board level, but it's really piecemeal. And you know, the whole it's like the whole sort of executive layer needs a sort of injection of competence. Yeah, everybody, and that's really challenging. And as a result of that, I think when people are making those business decisions, as Fiona says, they don't necessarily even acknowledge or realize yet that sustainability is a mainstream consideration and that needs to be part of every single everyday decision. So we're not there yet. Um, and therefore, going back to your question about product and banking product, you know, we're very much at the stage where the sustainable product portfolio is out on one side and it's very much on the lending side rather than deposit side. So we have banks with sustainable lending targets. They're struggling in some cases to find qualifying investments. And so that they've got, in fact, some of the larger banks in New Zealand, you know, have said we're not going to meet. We've set ourselves these targets. We're not going to meet them because we can't find or we can't verify the additional sustainable attributes that we need. So we're in this sort of circle, this sort of unvirtuous circle at the moment, which is really challenging. So I have not seen that we're there yet with the thought process around deposits, around what's being done with my deposit. I'm sure it will come, but it's not there at the moment.
So if you were to compare, contrast, and anyone can take this as the product which might be able to be a driver to take more green assets, or we need to we need to build this into everything. And we've seen that some large financial institutions recently came out of SBTI. There's maybe some fracturing in terms of the different voluntary arrangements. There's not necessarily, as Simon alluded to, the leveling up in regulation, because a lot of it is still very much single materiality based, and the risks that financial institutions face directly rather than those external risks. What are the things that from that point of view would sort of determine, well, how does one engage? Is it about, well, we want to force large financial institutions to have products, or we say, well, we will switch institutions, like, so as I mentioned earlier, Christian Aid moving from Barclays to Lloyds. Others have considered, wholesale switches. It might not be able to go from the most polluting to the least polluting, because that might mean that they might not access the same services. But actually, one of the insights in the update data we'll have in this report is that there's a huge differential between those who are deep into the most polluting, deforesting supply chains. The 290 kilotons per $1 billion never quite is easy to visualize, as much as for every $100, that's a full suitcase, a 29 kilo suitcase of carbon equivalent that is attached from the average US bank deposit right now. So in terms of mobilizing that, do we go down the route of trying to create an ecosystem of products? Or do we sort of say, well, we've got to empty the suitcases and find other institutions who are going to be able to manage to the same rigor and level of service that we need to be able to, as Fiona, you said, manage the business. And anyone can take that.
So first, switching bank accounts as a corporate is not easy. It's hard enough as an individual. So I wouldn't underestimate the significant pain that would take. And getting the buy-in to do that on these grounds would be challenging. And I think as people, anyone here wants to see the change in the system, we need to be careful about the enemies we create in the process. So pick your battles. But in the same, this also picks up on the transition arguments, right? Or, the old metaphor, right? If you want your friends to stop smoking, don't just get new friends who don't smoke. Stick with your friends and try and get them to stop smoking. Particularly in the corporate context, we're talking about enormously powerful corporations who do have that sway. So my almost personal view would be to engage, because the reality is there aren't going to be that many options. And again, in the context of pick your battles and look for where you compromise, at the moment, there's a lot to be gained from that engagement. So pushing your large banks to develop products, but more just to develop a corporate philosophy, particularly on the deposit side where there is high liquidity. On the investment side, that's different. But there you also get trapped into the discussion on how many aggregation points of aggregation and intermediaries there are in the system that make it so difficult. But yeah, I'll pause there because it'd be great to get other comments.
And maybe Simon, in terms of those thoughts on what would the most powerful argument be in that engagement. So if you were in front of a BlackRock in that example, and you were a massive company with billions, or even, we're sort of saying trillions behind you, how would you mobilize that agency most effectively?
Yeah. Previous CEO of Nestle made the observation a few years ago, it's a while now, nobody ever asked for the internet. The idea that, the buyer has, the ability or interest for discontinuous demand. Yeah. The evidence is slim at best. Yeah. So, they'll ask for a green toothpaste rather than a pink toothpaste. But that's not going to move the needle. And sure, we can get a few billionaires through UBS to push buttons, but actually the evidence is quite clear. Yeah, take BlackRock. We know it doesn't push the needle, and when the threat is that it may push the needle, they leave the club. So I think we're sitting here not having a chat about things that might make a difference. I think we're long past that. We're sitting here having a chat about what needs to happen to make a big difference quite quickly. And demand side shifts aren't going to do it. We've got we've got to get our heads around this. This is not a color of toothpaste moment. Yeah. So what might that mean? So what would make a difference to the BlackRock Liberia moment? Yeah. So let me come back to it. So it's clear. So anti-money laundering rules only apply to payments. They don't apply to investments. Yeah. And so if the crook in Liberia put money into a BlackRock account, which actually they couldn't do, but suppose they could, then it becomes subject to AML.
Yeah.
But if BlackRock invests in a way that they benefit directly from what that crook is doing, AML rules can't be applied. It is a very odd hole in the system, not by coincidence. Yeah. And so if BlackRock knew that the fact that it was benefiting from criminal activity in Liberia would trigger not a response from the Liberian Ministry of Environment, but from its regulator in the US, every lawyer would be on it by 7:05 in the morning. That it's a complete shift because it's a jurisdictional shift and the potential penalties are huge. Yeah. And so I don't mean to say that's the only game in town. I like green toothpaste. I don't use pink toothpaste myself. But we've got to be reasonable in an unreasonable moment as to what it takes to do the job. Back to your point about capabilities, I was sitting with a senior central banker here yesterday morning, and his answer to that question is that you introduce right and proper related to climate into supervisory oversight of board capabilities. Yeah, and that you come in through the top and that cascades down, because at that point, every board member goes to the CEO and the team, you've got to show me, yeah, that I am in compliance
Yeah.
with our supervisor's requirements and that there is full-blooded capability in the system that does not leave me vulnerable legally, either subject to, personal indemnity insurance or not, if I'm aware that it isn't okay and I am not making those changes. That would solve your capability problem pretty fast, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it has done historically. So a step-by-step model of let's try and persuade people to get, no, we don't have the time for that.
Yeah.
So just to say, I completely agree with that, particularly on the investment side. My comments are very much in the cash side. So whereas like you're making payroll, and so I completely, wholeheartedly agree. The demand side on the investment side and push on the regulatory and policy discussion here is absolutely critical,
Yeah.
right? That we don't have the right policy conditions for change.
Yeah.
We do not have them at any level, top down, UN, regional government.
Yeah.
The whole system needs a thorough scrub to get us aligned. So on that, I'm completely agreeing. It's more on the day-to-day cash management. You'll make a lot of enemies if you try to move your payroll, bank accounts, and everything else, because the prize is exactly as Simon's saying at the on the investment side.
And it may well be that the mobilization of agency is in the ultimate beneficiaries on the trillions saying we need financial regulation to change and financial law to change so that some of those things that you described become possible. And
Yeah, so two quick add-ons to where's the driver, which is your point. So, there are lots of drivers, but I'm feeling mean-spirited this morning, so I'll stick to the miserable ones. What has shifted Shell? It was litigation.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, what has shifted the Netherlands? It was litigation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are now 4,000 significant cases of litigation happening around the world. And at the moment, given the slothfulness of legislators and populist outburst around the world, actually litigation becomes an interesting play. So what are we missing? Well, we're missing litigation of the regulators.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that will be, I will easily predict a theme in 2024. Why aren't the regulators imposing right and proper supervisory requirements around climate risk? They are not fulfilling their mandate. Somebody should sue them.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we will see an outburst of litigation against regulators next year around the world. Happy to place a few bets, actually, since I'm an inside trader.
Yeah.
To see the way that goes through. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, because as the numbers look worse, we begin to look at a different suite of instruments
Yeah.
in kind of playing this forward.
Yeah. Maybe Becky, maybe it's going to be a sort of coming up to last words. I mean, but you saw from the Saudi Aramco case, I think that the banks, for the first time in that UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, were adjoined to the complaint. So litigation is feeling like it's lapping on the door now of institutions. Do you see that kind of coming through? Or yeah, what other reflections?
It just seems pretty depressing that that's really the only means that we think is going to work. I mean, my head agrees with you, but my heart is sad that that's potentially true. And it just, yeah, it's a shame if we can't find another way to change the system, because it's the system that needs changing. But the challenge is the system protects itself, right? I mean, that's how it's been designed. And so how do you break a system and reset a system? The only instrument we have to hand is litigation, but that's just going to make lawyers rich.
So, so one of the kind of key priority areas that we WBCSD have had at COP is around this misalignment on corporate performance and accountability that we're getting to here. The way that sustainability performance is not currently rewarded or incentivized. So take Shell's example, for example, it's trading at a PE ratio of about 3 relative to ExxonMobil at 8. So the board are in a really tough position. And those kind of ratios, people start thinking maybe there are plenty of other oil and gas companies with a lot of cash reserves that would quite happily acquire a major European-based oil and gas company.
Yeah.
And so this global dynamic where you have perverse incentives through the system perpetuating the dislocation of value to performance is a real problem.
Yeah.
And there was a UN COP presidential roundtable on private sector accountability and regulation earlier this week that I was privileged to observe. And it's recognized. We have the FSB, we have the ECB, we have the Winters, it's recognized. We need systemic change to drive that forward. So whilst litigation is extremely powerful, I think we need to be careful that it's litigation that's tackling the system problem and not targeting a few companies that might actually. So I think regulatory, the ICJ case, particularly on the small island states, is extremely powerful, but it has to create a groundswell so we don't perpetuate the dislocation of capital and the misallocation of capital in the system.
Yeah. I think that may be a moment to wrap up. The Carbon Bankroll was trying to make some of these systemic connections. So firstly, it was actually confronting people with an insight they really weren't aware of in terms of, oh, actually, if we trace this through, we are related to this story. And in the same way that regulation, well, it's driven by what then politicians will find is possible, is often influenced by what they see people calling for and doing. And in particular, some of the largest playing actors in terms of corporations, universities, faith groups, others. What we sort of see is that there will be a connection with all of this. Whereas the start of the circle, well, we don't know, but what we do know is that companies are now starting to ask the question, and banks are starting to kind of having to ask themselves, well, what is it that we do and how we respond? Want to thank you all for the conversation today. It's not it's never a straightforward linear answer, but I think it will be something which maybe grows and these new behaviors and insights flow through into the world. Thanks very much. Thank you.